Good evening, my friends, and welcome to another journey through the corridors of time. Tonight, I invite you to step back 8 centuries to a world where faith was built not only in hearts, but in stone. Close your eyes for a moment. It is dawn in the winter of the year 1145. Mist curls over the meadows of northern France. A bell tolls from a wooden tower, slow and hollow, its sound drifting through the fog like a prayer. In the distance, a great shape rises from the earth, a forest of scaffolding, ropes, and stone. Hundreds of hands move in silence. Masons, carpenters, monks, their breath turning to clouds in the cold morning air. They are building something that has never been seen before, a church so tall it seems to pierce the heavens. Stone by stone, arch by arch, they are lifting the earth toward God. At first, the villagers do not understand. Why must it be so high? They ask. Why must the walls be filled with glass instead of stone? And the master builder, covered in dust, answers quietly, because the light is the closest thing we have to God. This is where our story begins, in the age when men and women believed that beauty itself could be holy. When the world was dark and light was salvation. When architecture became more than shelter, it became a prayer in stone. The dream we call Gothic was not born in a day. It rose slowly, like dawn breaking after a long night. It was a dream of light, of height, of hope, a dream that taught humanity to look upward. Tonight, we will follow that dream from the shadowed Romanesque halls to the luminous cathedrals of Chartres, Reims, and Notre Dame. We will listen to the voices of those who built them and to the silence that still lives within their walls. If that sounds like your kind of weird history, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these quiet little journeys into forgotten worlds. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's oddly comforting to know who else is wandering through the night with us, one story at a time. So settle in, let the flicker of your candle be your stained glass, and the rhythm of your heartbeat your church bell. Because this is not just a story of architecture, it is a story of belief and of how humanity once tried to touch heaven with nothing but faith and stone. The dream that touched the sky. It begins with a sound. A single bell breaking the silence of a cold morning in the 12th century. The mist still clings to the fields of northern France, thin as a veil, pale as breath. Beyond the small wooden houses, the ground trembles faintly. A cart creaks. Stones grind against each other. Voices murmur, then rise rough, rhythmic, steady. The villagers have gathered at the edge of a construction site that seems almost alive. Ropes tighten, pulleys strain, and a great block of limestone ascends toward the gray sky. Men, little more than silhouettes in the fog, pull together in unison, their boots sinking into the wet earth, their shoulders bent, their hands raw. They do not see the whole of what they are building. Not yet. Only the foundations. The beginnings of arches that reach nowhere yet already. They seem to stretch beyond the world they know. A priest stands nearby, murmuring prayers over the stones. Children watch from behind their mother's skirts. Someone crosses themselves, whispering a name not of the builder, but of the saint to whom this church will belong. And the bell keeps ringing. The year is 1145. Europe is a continent of pilgrims, kings, and hunger. The fields belong to the church, the castles to the lords, and the heavens always to God. Faith is not an idea, it is the air they breathe, the fear that shapes every dawn and dusk. In this world, a man's soul is weighed as carefully as grain, and his place in the order of things is fixed from birth. The earth is low, dark, and full of toil. But the sky, the sky is where eternity begins. And so humanity begins to dream upward from the darkness of Romanesque vaults, heavy and low like a sheltering cave. Something new begins to rise. a vision, half faith and half rebellion. The builders of this new age will not be content to dwell beneath the weight of stone. They will make stone itself learn to fly. They will pierce it with windows. They will lace it with ribs and arches. They will turn the house of God into a forest of light. For centuries to come, these cathedrals will stand like frozen music, vast, trembling, vertical hymns. They will transform entire cities into sanctuaries, and their spires will mark not only where God resides, but what mankind dares to imagine. But on this cold morning, none of that yet exists. Only the dream does. A mason wipes sweat from his forehead and looks up at the blank sky. He cannot read or write. He does not know that historians will one day call his craft Gothic. To him, it is simply faith made visible. He lays each stone like a prayer, hoping that when his hands are gone, the walls will still speak for him. The villagers call it folie d'auteur, the madness of height. Why must it be so high? Why must heaven be measured in meters of stone? Why does God need towers that scrape the clouds? The answer lies not in ambition, but in longing. To live in the 12th century was to live in shadow. The Black Death was still to come, but famine, war, and fear already ruled. Every thunderstorm was a sermon, every eclipse a warning. The church was the heart of every town, and its bells divided time, morning, noon, and vespers, until night fell like a final benediction. To believe was to survive, and to build was to believe. The cathedral was more than a house for worship. It was a compass for the soul. Its walls were not merely vertical stones. They were ladders leading upward, symbol by symbol, rib by rib. Every measurement, every proportion carried meaning. The length of the nave reflected the body of Christ, the intersection of transept and choir, the cross itself. Yet faith alone did not lift these towers. It was joined by something older, darker, a fear that the world below could never be redeemed unless it reached above. To climb higher was to escape sin, to chase the light of heaven before death claimed you. That fear, that hope, that desperate yearning, this was the Gothic dream, and it burned like a candle in the hearts of builders and believers alike. Watch them at work. Dozens of men hauling ropes, chiseling, stacking blocks as heavy as oxen. Each piece carved by hand, every surface adjusted to the breadth of the arch above it. To raise one cathedral could take a lifetime, sometimes several. Children who played in the mud beside the scaffolds would grow old and die before the roof was finished. Yet still the work continued, as if the stones themselves demanded completion. It was said that each mason left a mark, a tiny carved symbol hidden in the corners, under the cornices, between the ribs. Some shaped like stars, others like crosses, some like nothing at all, just proof that he existed. A way to whisper, I was here. The master builder, or magister operatus, walked among them with a parchment-rolled drawings that resembled visions more than blueprints. Geometry mixed with prayer, mathematics married to faith, the circle and the cross, the number 3 and the number 7 sacred proportions that promise harmony between man and God. They built without steel, without engines, without modern logic, and yet what they raised still humbles the engineers of today. When the first walls of the new Cathedral of Saint Denis rose outside Paris, something extraordinary happened. Inside, the abbot Suger spoke of Lux Nova, the new light. He believed that light itself was divine, that to enter a luminous church was to glimpse the radiance of heaven. So he opened the walls, filled them with glass, and let color flood the sacred space. In the old churches, the world had been dark and solid. Now, for the first time, stone began to disappear. The sun transformed into theology, blue for the Virgin Mary, red for martyrdom, gold for glory. Stories of saints and angels unfolded in color sermons for those who could not read. When morning light passed through them, the floor itself seemed to breathe. To the people who entered, it was a miracle. For a moment, they believed that the divine could live within the ordinary. That light was not just above them, but all around. And so the idea spread from Saint Denis to Chartres, from Reims to Amiens, from Canterbury to Cologne. The Gothic dream traveled like fire through Europe, igniting every city it touched. But the dream was not pure. Nothing human ever is. Behind every rising tower were debts, taxes, and crushed hands. Beneath every miracle of stone lay bones of those who built it. Beauty demanded sacrifice, sometimes blind, sometimes cruel. The church spoke of redemption, but also of control. The cathedrals proclaimed both salvation and authority. Their height reminded peasants of the power that reigned above them, divine, yes, but also political. To look up was to feel small, to kneel was to belong. And yet, paradoxically, in their smallness, people found meaning. The very act of standing beneath a vault so high that the air shimmered with light, it humbled and exalted them at once. They were dust, and yet they had helped raise eternity. It was fear and beauty, bound together, one feeding the other, like candle and flame. Centuries later, when we stand before the same cathedrals in Paris, in Amiens, in Cologne, we still tilt our heads back and ask the same question. Why did they build so high? The answers are many. To honor God, to outshine neighboring cities, to prove the glory of their age, to heal the soul through beauty. But perhaps the truest answer is the simplest one, because they could not bear the weight of earth anymore. In every arch and every column lies a human confession that life is hard, brief, and heavy, but that somewhere above the clouds there must be meaning. To build upward was to declare, we are not trapped here, we can rise. The Gothic dream, then, is not only about architecture, it is about the human heart refusing gravity. It is about believing that heaven is not beyond reach if we build carefully enough, if we imagine fiercely enough, if we keep faith long enough. 800 years later, the bell still rings. The mist still curls around the towers of Chartres at dawn. Tourists take photographs. Pigeons flutter over gargoyles. But the feeling, the quiet, trembling awe remains unchanged. For when we enter a Gothic cathedral, we do not just step into the past. We step into a dream that has not yet ended. A dream carved in stone, gilded by sunlight, and kept alive by silence. And though centuries have turned faith into art and art into history, the stones still pray. They whisper the same words the masons once knew. Look up. There is more than dust and fear. There is light. So when the bell tolls again, whether in your memory or your imagination, let it call you not to worship, but to wonder. To ask the oldest question humanity has ever known: why do we build so high? And what are we really reaching for? The Gothic dream. When stone learned to pray, and humanity learned to look toward the sky. Before the rise from the shadows of stone, before the dream of height, there was the weight of earth. Before the shimmer of stained glass, there was shadow. And before humanity learned to build toward heaven, it learned to hide from the world. Imagine Europe in the 11th century. The landscape is not yet dotted with the soaring spires of Gothic cathedrals. Instead, churches squat low to the ground, heavy as mountains, thick as castles. They are built to withstand more than time. They are built to resist fear itself. These are the Romanesque churches, the ancestors of the Gothic dream. Their walls are thick, their windows small, their arches round like the eyes of a watchful guardian. Inside, the air is dim, close, filled with the scent of wax and stone dust. The sound of chanting rolls through the nave like thunder, trapped in a cave. For the people who entered these churches, the world outside was chaos. Barons fought each other, kingdoms rose and fell, famine lingered at the door. But here inside these walls, there was order, silence, protection. Each church was a fortress of faith, a place where the divine could not be attacked, where the trembling soul could breathe behind the armor of stone. You did not look up in a Romanesque church. You bowed your head. Its architecture whispered not of assent, but of submission. The faithful entered through low portals, stepped onto cold floors, and felt the weight of the ceiling pressed down like the hand of God himself. It was humbling, it was terrifying, and it was safe. The Romanesque style was born from a world of pilgrims, people who traveled not for pleasure, but for penance. Across the muddy roads of medieval Europe, they trudged from shrine to shrine, hoping to shorten their time in purgatory. Each church was a stop on the map of salvation, a shelter for weary souls. Their rounded arches, thick pillars, and dim interiors spoke to a theology rooted in fear and endurance. Life was a trial, heaven a far-off reward, and the church solid, immovable, a reminder of God's eternal strength. To step inside was to feel enclosed, enveloped, almost swallowed by faith. You did not gaze upon the light. You waited for it, as one waits for mercy. The art reflected this mood. Frescoes glowed faintly on curved walls. Christ enthroned in judgment. Demons devouring the damned. Saints gazing with stern compassion. Faces were stylized, rigid, not meant to resemble humanity, but holiness. This was not beauty meant to seduce, it was beauty meant to warn. To believe was to obey. To be saved was to endure. The Romanesque church was not a song of joy, it was a psalm of endurance carved in stone. If you were to stand in a Romanesque nave, you would notice something ancient in its proportions. The round arch, borrowed from the Romans, defines the style. It is simple, solid, and deeply human. There is a comfort in its completeness, no risk, no reach, just the perfection of the circle. The circle meant eternity, the endlessness of divine order. The rounded arch repeated that promise, safe, self-contained, unbroken. But it also kept the human spirit grounded. The walls must be thick to support that arch. The windows, small and narrow, let in little light. The building feels almost inward, as if its purpose is to protect the sacred flame from the winds of the world. And so, for nearly 2 centuries, Europe prayed in the dark. The church was both mother and jailer. Its walls kept the soul secure but also sealed. Then, somewhere in that darkness, a restlessness began. It did not start with kings or scholars, but with a whisper in the hearts of those who built. The masons who carved stone day after day began to imagine new shapes, sharper, taller, lighter. The monks who copied holy texts started writing about light, not just as symbol, but as presence. The theologians spoke of divine illumination of God as not only judge, but radiance. It was as if, in the middle of that heavy stillness, a door had opened, and through it came light. The Romanesque world had believed in God's power to contain. The coming age would believe in his power to reveal. People began to long not just for safety, but for transcendence. Not just to be protected, but to be transformed. The walls that once comforted now began to feel like cages. Faith, which once knelt in darkness, began to look toward the window. In the year 1137, a man named Abbot Suger took charge of the Abbey of Saint Denis near Paris. He was not a mason nor an engineer, but a visionary. He had seen enough of the Romanesque world, its heaviness, its gloom, its confinement, and he wanted something more. In his writings, Suger spoke of light not as symbol, but as path. The dull mind rises to truth through material things, and in seeing this, light is resurrected from its former submersion. For him, light was theology made visible. If the soul could not reach heaven, then heaven must descend to the soul through color, through illumination, through architecture itself. And so, he began to rebuild Saint Denis. He ordered the walls to be open, the windows enlarged, the stone made to serve, not suppress, the light. He believed that the material could lead to the spiritual, that beauty could lead to God. When the new choir of Saint Denis was consecrated, those who entered felt something they had never felt before. The ceiling seemed to float. Color poured from every direction. For the first time, the house of God was not a fortress, it was a window. What Suger began, others would continue across France, across Europe, across centuries. But in the beginning, it was fragile. A whisper of hope in a world still ruled by shadow. The masons tested their courage with new shapes, the pointed arch, the ribbed vault. They found that these forms distributed weight differently, allowing walls to rise higher and thinner. It was as if stone itself had learned to breathe. The round arch of the Romanesque world complete, closed, content gave way to the pointed arch, an arrow of longing. Where the circle symbolized eternity, the pointed arch symbolized aspiration. It reached upward, beyond itself, towards something unseen. That single change the point, replacing the round, would alter the entire soul of architecture. It was a theological revolution rendered in geometry. For the first time, the church no longer held man down, it lifted him. The ceiling no longer pressed upon the faithful, it opened above them like a canopy of light. The building no longer contained God, it became his echo. Not everyone rejoiced. To some, these new designs were dangerous both physically and spiritually. What if the walls collapsed? What if pride had taken the place of piety? What if man, in trying to reach God, repeated the sin of Babel? There was truth in the fear. Some early experiments failed. Vaults cracked, towers fell, and entire choirs crumbled into ruin. But failure did not stop the dream, it refined it. Builders learned from disaster, mastering the balance of weight and faith. The Gothic age would be born not only of inspiration, but of calculation of minds that measured heaven with compass and rope. Still, the warning lingered. Every height carries a shadow. Every act of creation risks collapse. To build toward heaven was to court both grace and downfall. In the small towns of Burgundy, Aquitaine, and Normandy, the transformation was gradual. Old Romanesque churches began to sprout pointed arches over their doorways, slender columns inside their naves. It was as though the old world were dreaming of the new, hesitating at the threshold. The people did not yet know the word Gothic. To them, it was still God's house, still stone and prayer. But when the sunlight fell differently through the new windows, when it touched their faces in blues and reds and golds, something changed inside them. Perhaps they did not name it faith. Perhaps they only felt for the first time that holiness could be beautiful. That heaven could shine not only after death, but here, now, in this life of toil and dust. The Romanesque church had said, "Fear God." The Gothic one would say, "See him." It is tempting to think of the Gothic revolution as sudden, as if one morning Europe simply decided to reach upward, but no dream arrives in an instant. It grows, slow as moss, patient as dawn. The Romanesque builders laid the foundation for everything that followed. Their mastery of vaults, their devotion to proportion, their discipline of order, all of it became the soil from which the Gothic would rise. Every stone of those dark churches was a first syllable in a prayer that would take centuries to finish. Every arch, even rounded, was a rehearsal for the flight to come. And so, from within those heavy walls, the first light appeared faint, uncertain, yet unstoppable. It was not rebellion, not yet. It was evolution, faith learning to imagine itself differently. The earth began to dream of the sky, and the stones began to dream of light. By the mid-12th century, Europe was alive with a quiet awakening. The Crusades had opened routes to the east. Scholars rediscovered Aristotle. Cities began to hum with trade and craft. The world was changing not enough to destroy faith, but enough to reshape it. The church, once content to guard the soul, now wanted to inspire it. No longer just fortress, it sought to become revelation. The Romanesque cathedral had been man's refuge from the darkness of the world. The Gothic cathedral would be man's bridge to the light of heaven. The transition was not only architectural, it was existential. Humanity was beginning to rediscover itself. The same curiosity that built cathedrals would soon study stars, chart maps, write poems, and paint faces with emotion. It all began here in stone, learning to open its eyes. Before the light fully arrived, the old world resisted. Some churches remained Romanesque for centuries, refusing the pointed arch, holding to the weight of certainty. They stand still today, sturdy, grave, loyal to their first purpose. Step into one, and you can feel the difference. The air is cool, the light dim, your footsteps echo. It is as though the building still prays the way it always did, with silence, with submission. And yet, even here, the whisper of light is present. Even in the darkest church, a single candle can reveal the curve of a future dream. The Gothic age would not erase the Romanesque, it would complete it. For shadow gives light its meaning. Without darkness, illumination is only glare. And so, somewhere between shadow and sun, between weight and grace, the world began to change. The builders lifted their eyes from the earth. The arches stretched upward. The walls began to sing. The dream was no longer to hide within stone, it was to release light through it. The church would no longer protect humanity from the world, it would invite the world to become sacred. In the centuries that followed, the pointed arch would multiply across Europe, and each would tell the same story, of men and women who believed that beauty could save the soul, that light could teach the spirit to rise, and that even the heaviest stone could learn the language of heaven. But that story, the story of ascent, was only beginning. For now, the world still stands in the half-light of dawn, watching its first cathedrals lift their faces to the sky. The language of light. It began, as most revolutions do, not with a shout but with a shimmer. A single window in the Abbey of Saint Denis glowed one morning brighter than the rest, its colored glass set into a frame of newly carved stone. To the men below, it was as if the wall itself had caught fire from heaven. The abbot who had ordered it, a man named Soothe, stood there in silence. He had spent his life among relics and prayers, but that morning he saw something different, not the reflection of God, but the very substance of him. Light was no longer just a gift from above, it was the divine. Before this moment, churches had been dark as caves. The thick Romanesque walls, protective, massive, patient, had allowed only narrow slits for light. Inside, the air was heavy with incense and shadow. The faithful knelt in half darkness, murmuring prayers that vanished into the stone. But Soothe wanted more. He wanted the faithful to see heaven, not just imagine it. He wrote in his chronicles of the Lux Nova, the new light through which he believed the soul might ascend to God. And so, masons opened the walls, the vaults lifted higher, arches split the stone like ribs opening the body of a living thing. The church became a vessel not of weight but of radiance. To walk into Saint Denis after its transformation was to feel something like a miracle. Light no longer fell into the church, it moved through it. Gold shimmered on chalices. Red and blue glass turned the air into a slow turning sea. The world inside was no longer bound by gravity. In that light, even silence had color. The medieval world saw light not merely as a natural element, but as a spiritual truth. From the writings of Saint Augustine to the vision of Pseudo-Dionysius, light was described as the purest emanation of God, the bridge between matter and spirit. In their theology, light was creation's first word. Let there be light, not as an act of physics, but of revelation. It was illumination in both the literal and the mystical sense. To see was to understand. To stand in light was to touch truth. The Gothic builders absorbed this idea as their creed. If God was light, then to build in light was to build for God. Thus, every window became a sermon, every color, a verse. Every beam of sunlight that passed through the glass was a prayer written by the Sunday, the masons, the glaziers, the abbots. They were not merely constructing spaces for worship, they were composing symphonies of light. The cathedral became an instrument that played with the Sunday few could read in those centuries. Books were treasures copied by hand, illuminated with gold, locked in monasteries, or held in the trembling hands of kings. But every villager could read the windows. The cathedral was the Bible of the poor. On the glass, stories unfolded like dreams. Noah's Ark rising above blue waves, Moses lifting his staff to part a crimson sea, the Virgin crowned beneath rays of gold, Christ, pale and gentle, holding out his wounded hands. The windows told of miracles and warnings alike, of saints burned, of martyrs crowned, of the apocalypse and the promise of paradise. Children learned their first scriptures by color. Farmers entering the nave after a day of toil found not a sermon but a vision. They stood surrounded by living light, and for a moment they belonged to eternity. Each hue carried meaning, carefully chosen and dearly paid for. Blue, the most sacred of all, was the color of the Virgin, a symbol of humility, purity, and the unreachable sky. It was drawn from crushed lapis lazuli imported from far-off Afghanistan, worth more than gold. At Chartres, the blue still glows with an otherworldly intensity, as if it remembers the prayers of centuries. Red burned with the light of sacrifice, a color of blood, love, and divine passion. It bled across scenes of Christ's wounds, across roses and thrones and angels' wings. Green spoke of rebirth and spring, the renewal of the soul through faith. Gold was divine fire, not merely decoration, but revelation. To medieval eyes, gold was not a color at all, but a substance that contained light, like heaven poured into metal. When the sun passed through these windows, it was not just illumination, it was transfiguration. The church became a prism for grace. Imagine for a moment the men who made these miracles. The glass makers, working by the edge of the forest, their furnaces glowing like small suns. They mixed sand, ash, and metal oxides, each secret formula handed down like a blessing. Their kilns roared. Molten color flowed, trembling like honey, then cooled into sheets thin as breath. The glaziers traced saints and angels in lines of lead, joining each piece like verses in a psalm. They worked not for fame, their names were rarely recorded, but for devotion. Each window was a covenant, each fragment a prayer in glass. When it was lifted into place, the craftsmen stepped back and watched the sun strike their work. In that instant, the glass ceased to be an object, it became spirit. The light that passed through it belonged to no man. To walk into a Gothic cathedral at noon was to enter a moving sea of color. The windows burned like constellations. Red spilled across the flagstones like blood. Blue gathered in the vaults like midnight. Gold fluttered along the walls in shifting halos. As clouds drifted, the colors moved. Light danced upon the pillars and across the faces of those who prayed. The cathedral was never still, it breathed, it shimmered, it sang. In those moments, one could almost hear what the builders must have dreamed. That stone could become sound, and light could become language. The Gothic world did not separate beauty from holiness. To stand in light was to stand in grace. To be dazzled was to be saved. Yet, even light has shadows. The same rays that illuminated the saints also revealed the grotesques, the gargoyles crouched along the eaves, the demons writhing at the edges of the windows. For every story of salvation, there was one of damnation. The glass reminded believers not only of paradise, but of what awaited those who strayed from it. To look upon a stained glass window was to see the whole map of the soul, heaven above, hell below, the fragile, flickering human figure in between. And as the sun moved across the sky, these figures seemed to move with it like souls climbing, falling, pleading in color. Light was mercy, but it was also judgment. In the Gothic cathedral, time itself became visible. Morning light entered through the eastern rose, cool and blue, like the promise of creation. By noon, the southern windows blazed in gold, the fullness of life. And when evening fell, the western glass turned red, echoing both sunset and sacrifice. The day became a sermon without words. The journey of the sun mirrored the journey of the soul. Dawn was birth, noon was grace, dusk was death and hope. The architects had turned astronomy into theology. Their churches were aligned not merely to the city, but to the cosmos itself. Each ray of light had meaning, each shadow, purpose. They built not only with stone, but with time. No image captured the Gothic spirit more perfectly than the rose window. Round, radiant, and infinitely intricate, it was the cosmos made visible, a wheel of color and light. From its center, light poured like creation's first breath. Petals of glass expanded outward, telling stories of apostles, virtues, and angels. The rose was both geometry and prayer. It spoke of divine order, symmetry born of faith. To look into it was to gaze upon a miniature universe, each line leading inward toward God. When the sun struck the rose, the entire nave filled with spinning fragments of light. The air seemed alive, as if heaven itself were breathing through the walls. Every cathedral, in the end, was a Bible that moved. Its windows were the Old and New Testaments written in color. Its columns were prophets, its arches, psalms. The choir was the gospel, the spire, the amen. When a pilgrim entered, he stepped not into a building, but into a story that surrounded him completely. He was both reader and character. The light touched him as it touched the saints. And when he left, blinking in the sunlight, he carried a little of that color with him, a memory of heaven's grammar written in gold and blue. Centuries later, long after the mason's hands had turned to dust, the windows remained. Wars came, kings fell, faiths shifted. But when the morning sun struck the glass, the same color still awakened. The same stories burned again. Even now, to step into Chartres or Saint-Chapelle is to feel that ancient heartbeat. You can stand beneath those windows and realize this is not just history. It is light still speaking, still teaching, still praying. The world has changed, but the message is the same. Light is divine because it refuses to die. Thus, the great transition was complete, from the heavy vaults of the Romanesque to the soaring ribs of the Gothic, from darkness to light, from fear to faith. The stones no longer hid from heaven. They reached for it. The cathedrals no longer shielded souls. They lifted them. In the shimmer of colored glass, the Middle Ages glimpsed eternity. And in that light, that lux nova, they found not only God, but themselves. In the beginning was light, and in the light, all things were made visible. The Gothic dream began not in stone, but in the heart that dared to see light as God. Faith in stone. The dream of the Gothic cathedral was not born in marble halls, nor written in royal decrees. It was carved, chiseled, and bled into existence by hands that few remembered. Before the light could pour through glass, before arches could rise toward heaven, there was the labor, the endless, aching rhythm of men in stone. Faith, here, was not a thought, it was a craft, and the price of heaven was paid in dust. At dawn, they arrived, men with tools slung across their shoulders, their breath steaming in the chill. Masons, carpenters, quarrymen, blacksmiths, each bound to the same colossal task. They came from villages miles away, drawn not by coin alone, but by something harder to name. For them, building a cathedral was a calling, not a career, but a covenant. Each blow of the hammer was both labor and liturgy. Each block lifted a silent psalm. In the hierarchy of heaven and earth, they occupied the middle ground, not noble, not holy, yet somehow indispensable to both. Their bodies bore the proof of their devotion: calloused hands, bowed backs, eyes that squinted against flying dust. And when one fell from the scaffolding, which happened often, a brief prayer was said, and the work continued. The cathedral did not stop for death. It absorbed it. Above them all stood the Magister Operis, the master of works. He was part architect, part priest, part sorcerer. Few could read his drawings, yet all obeyed them. His plans were not blueprints in the modern sense, they were visions rendered in chalk and geometry. He spoke the language of arches and ratios, of the sacred triangle and the perfect circle. Every measurement had meaning, every angle a theology of its own. He was the mediator between the material and the divine. The stones answered to his compass, as prayers answered to faith. Some said he worked by inspiration. Others whispered he was guided by angels. In truth, he was guided by mathematics, which, in that age, was perhaps the same thing. And when he walked among his men, he did not speak of beauty. He spoke of weight, of balance, of the pull of heaven against the push of earth. But behind his measured words, there was always the same burning question: how high can we go before the world breaks? The building site was a city in itself, a living organism of faith and function. Apprentices carried water and tools, learning the trade by repetition and pain. They spent years mastering the cut of the chisel, the rhythm of the hammer, before they could be trusted with a single visible stone. They belonged to guilds, those secret brotherhoods of craftsmen who guarded their knowledge like relics. Each guild had its signs, its oaths, its rituals, a faith within faith. To betray a secret of measurement or proportion was to sin against the craft itself. When evening came, they drank together in the taverns near the walls, laughing, arguing, singing songs about saints and stone. They were men of rough hands and rough words, but in their work there was a purity no sermon could match. Theirs was not the faith of priests, but of builders, the kind that proved belief with sweat, not scripture. Stone, it was both their burden and their blessing. It cut their skin, broke their bones, crushed their fingers, and yet it was the only medium through which they could touch the eternal. To carve stone was to challenge time itself. The mason knew that while he would die, his work might not. The cathedral would stand long after his name was forgotten, and perhaps that was enough. He had no need for immortality. He was already building it. The poet Villon, centuries later, would ask, "Where are the snows of yesteryear?" The masons would answer, "They melted into stone." Listen, the worksite itself was a kind of liturgy. The rhythmic pounding of mallets echoed like a heartbeat. The rasp of the saws, the creak of the pulleys, the chant of the workers lifting together, it was all music. A Gregorian rhythm of faith and fatigue. At noon, when the bell tolled for Angelus, they paused, wiped the sweat from their brows, and crossed themselves before returning to the task. They prayed not with words, but with endurance. Every stone laid was a confession. Every arch completed, an act of redemption. Their devotion was not gentle. It was carved, fractured, and mended like faith itself. The medieval mind saw the cathedral as more than a building. It was a living creature, a body that breathed through its vaults and veins of glass. The foundation was its feet, sunk deep in the earth. The nave, its chest, the spire, its outstretched hand reaching for heaven. Each mason, carpenter, and smith became a cell within this body. each performing his part in the great anatomy of faith. The blood that moved through it was not water or air, but belief pumped daily through the labor of countless souls. When the last stone was set, when the vaults finally closed above them, they believed they had built not just for God, but as God had once built the world with order, symmetry, and light. But beauty, as always, demanded blood. The scaffolds claimed lives, men slipping from beams slick with rain, ropes snapping beneath the weight of stone, tools shattered, hands mangled. There were no saints' relics to save them, only the mercy of their comrades and the slow rhythm of continued work. The villages near great cathedrals became towns of widows and orphans. The church promised their sacrifice was holy, that to die in the act of building God's house was a form of salvation. Perhaps it was, but the stones did not speak of that. They spoke only of endurance, of the stubborn will to lift the world a little higher, no matter the cost. No signatures mark the walls of Chartres. No sculptor's name adorns the angels of Reims. No mason's initials rest beneath the spire of Amiens. Their anonymity was deliberate, an act of humility. In a world where pride was sin, the artist was only an instrument, the work itself, the glory. They carved not to be remembered, but to remember. Each figure of stone was an echo of their faith, and in that echo, their souls found permanence. Centuries later, their names are still unknown, but their work endures proof that worship can outlast the worshiper. The Masons believed that every stone carried within it a secret, the way it wanted to stand, the direction of its strength. To work against that nature was to invite collapse. So they listened. They touched the stone, tapped it with the mallet, felt the vibration through their palms. It was a kind of communion, not of bread and wine, but of matter and spirit. The stone was stubborn, but it could be persuaded. It could be taught to rise. And in teaching it, the Masons themselves learned what faith truly was. Not certainty, but perseverance. To build was to pray. The cathedral rose not from command, but from devotion, generation after generation passing the torch of belief. The sons of Masons became Masons. Their sons, apprentices again. Each lifted stones their fathers had set. Each continued a work that might never be finished. For to them, the cathedral was not a project. It was a pilgrimage. They were not simply building a monument to God, they were walking toward him, one stone at a time. The French chroniclers called it Opus Dei, the work of God. And indeed it was, because in the act of creation, they mirrored the Creator. When the final stone was set, when the bell first rang across the valley, those who built it wept not because their labor was over, but because they had touched the eternal. Centuries have passed. The tools have rusted. The scaffolds have fallen. But the touch of those nameless hands still lingers in every surface. Run your fingers along the pillars of Notre Dame, and you are touching the fingerprints of the 12th century. Their devotion still hums within the stone, a quiet vibration of faith turned physical. Every chisel mark is a heartbeat, every imperfection, a memory of the human. The Gothic cathedrals were never perfect. They were alive. And that is what made them divine. When the wind howls through the arches, when the bells tremble and the gargoyles weep rain, it is easy to forget that these are not merely monuments. They are prayers, fossilized. Each tower stands as both triumph and warning. They remind us that faith can move mountains, but only by breaking backs. That beauty can reach heaven, but only by standing on the bones of those who built it. The cathedrals were born of paradox, faith carved from pain, grace shaped by gravity. Stone was their scripture, and labor their liturgy. And though the centuries have softened their edges, their message remains unchanged. That the human spirit, like stone, can be shaped into something that touches the sky. They built not for themselves, but for a God who lived in light. Yet in doing so, they left behind something greater than belief. They left behind proof. Engineering heaven, morning light spills through half-finished windows of colored glass, casting trembling mosaics on scaffolding wrapped around a half-built nave. The echo of hammers and chisels fills the air rhythmic, like the beating of a single giant heart. The year is 1180, and the dream of heaven is being drawn in geometry. In an age without blueprints, cranes, or steel, the builders of Gothic cathedrals managed to lift mountains. They defied the weight of stone, the pull of the earth, and even the limits of imagination. What they achieved was not merely architecture. It was theology made visible, a structure where faith and mathematics knelt side by side. In the centuries before the Gothic age, builders worked by intuition. They relied on inherited proportions and rules whispered from master to apprentice. But with the rise of Gothic architecture, something changed. For the first time, geometry was no longer just a craft, it became a sacred science. To a medieval mind, numbers were not cold abstractions. They were alive echoes of divine order. The square represented the earth, solid and stable. The circle stood for heaven, perfect and eternal. The triangle, the sign of the Trinity, connected both. And in the drawing huts beside great cathedrals, master masons began to weave these shapes together in ways that had never been seen before. They drew lines in dust and chalk circles, intersecting circles, triangles nested within squares, and from those lines rose columns, arches, and vaults that reached for the light. Geometry, to them, was not a tool to dominate nature, but a way to speak with God. When Abbot Suger of Saint Denis imagined his church reborn in the new light, Lux Nova, he called upon this sacred geometry. His masons carved heaven into stone not by chance, but by ratio and rhythm, by the belief that divine beauty could be measured, drawn, and raised. To understand how Gothic cathedrals soared, one must begin with the arch. In the Romanesque age, arches were round, sturdy, noble, but limited. Their curves pressed outward with a crushing force, demanding thick walls to hold them in. But then came the pointed arch, two curves meeting in a sharp kiss at the top, channeling the weight more steeply downward. That simple change, the meeting of two arcs, changed the world. It allowed roofs to climb higher, aisles to stretch wider, and light to flood where once there was only darkness. The pointed arch was not only a structural breakthrough, it was a theological statement. Its upward reach mirrored the human soul striving toward the divine. Each arch was a gesture of prayer, frozen in stone. To walk beneath one was to feel the lift of faith, to sense that even the laws of gravity had learned reverence. And yet, the pointed arch was no accident of devotion alone. It was also born from observation, perhaps borrowed from Islamic architecture, where crusaders and merchants had seen its grace in the mosques of the East. But when it reached Europe, it was baptized anew. The Christian world turned it into a ladder toward God. Above the arches, the ceiling, that vast expanse of stone, had long been the builder's torment. A Romanesque vault was heavy, its curved surface pressing down with relentless weight. To lift it higher was to invite collapse. But then came the ribbed vault, and with it, a miracle. Instead of a solid mass, the ceiling became a network of intersecting stone ribs, each one carrying a portion of the load. Between them, lighter materials filled the gaps. The result was a structure that seemed to float. The ribs formed a skeleton, elegant, rational, almost alive. The rib vault was a revelation because it turned weakness into strength. It distributed weight like veins carrying the lifeblood of the building. It allowed the nave to stretch, the choir to expand, and the windows to multiply. Suddenly, the walls were no longer prisons of stone. They were frames for light. And when sunlight poured through the stained glass, it did not simply fall upon the floor, it danced along the ribs, following the geometry of faith. To stand beneath those vaults was to stand inside a vision of order, a world held together by invisible laws. It was as if heaven itself had been given bones. Yet even with pointed arches and ribbed vaults, the cathedrals still groaned under their own weight. The higher they climbed, the more they threatened to crumble. The walls, now pierced with vast windows, could no longer bear the strain. And so the builders found a way to make their buildings breathe. They carried the weight outward, beyond the walls, using flying buttresses, great arched arms of stone that caught the thrust of the vaults and delivered it safely to the ground. From the outside, they looked like wings, as if the church itself had learned to fly. The flying buttress was a paradox. It was both strength and grace, structure and ornament. To the medieval mind, it symbolized the same truth preached in every sermon, that what is visible is only half the story. The true support lies beyond what the eye can see. In the embrace of those flying arches, the cathedrals rose higher than ever before. Chartres, Reims, Amiens, and Paris, each one a breath closer to heaven. From the ground, their buttresses looked like the outstretched arms of angels, holding the weight of the world. It is tempting to see all this as engineering genius alone, the triumph of skill over stone. But that would be to miss the deeper truth. For the builders of the Gothic age, mathematics was not a science apart from faith. It was a mirror of creation. To measure, to divide, to balance, these were not acts of reason alone, but acts of worship. They believed that God had written the universe in number and proportion, and that by uncovering its harmony, they could draw nearer to him. Vitruvius has spoken of architecture as imitation of nature. The medievals went further. They believed architecture could reveal the divine pattern behind nature. The circle and the square, heaven and earth, could meet in the cathedral's plan. The golden ratio, the sacred geometry, the perfect symmetry of light and form, all were fragments of God's mind, made visible. Thus, every Gothic cathedral was both a prayer and a proof that the human mind, when moved by faith, could translate eternity into stone. Little is known of the men who built these wonders. Most never signed their work. Their names are lost, but their vision remains. They were not mere craftsmen. They were theologians with chisels, poets of proportion. They spent their lives in scaffolds and drawing huts, their eyes tracing invisible lines of force and faith. They measured not only with compass and string, but with belief. Each stone was laid with ritual precision. Each joint whispered a prayer. They worked knowing they would never see the cathedral finished, and yet they built because to build was to believe. The master mason's art was a communion between intellect and soul. He read the laws of gravity as one reads scripture. He trusted in balance, in light, in grace. His cathedral was his creed, and his compass, his cross. We often speak of the Middle Ages as an age of superstition, of darkness, and ignorance. But within those centuries of faith lay an astonishing intellect, as sharp as any that came after. The Gothic cathedral is its proof. To raise a building like Amiens or Chartres required not only devotion, but precision, a deep understanding of material strength, thrust, load, and proportion. The builders calculated forces without algebra, balanced arches without calculus. Their mathematics was written in intuition, their engineering drawn in dust, yet their results still stand after 800 years. The Gothic cathedral was the medieval world's computer, telescope, and symphony all at once. It embodied what the human spirit could do when imagination and belief worked together. They did not build to conquer nature. They built to reveal it, to show that within the laws of weight and light, God's hand was already written. As centuries passed, each generation of builders reached higher. The competition between cathedrals became almost sacred rivalry. Who could lift their spire closer to heaven? Who could let in more light? At Beauvais, they dared too far. The choir rose so high that it collapsed in 1284, crushing the dream for a moment. Yet, even failure was beautiful proof that humanity's longing for the infinite would always test the limits of the possible. For the Gothic builders, heaven was not a destination beyond the clouds. It was something glimpsed through glass and geometry, something that shimmered within the order of things. Every hammer strike was a note in a hymn, every measurement an act of faith. The cathedral was not only built for worship, it was worship. Its stones spoke the language of devotion more eloquently than any sermon. The masons did not separate the sacred from the technical. To them, there was no difference between designing a vault and composing a psalm. Both were ways of seeking God. And so, through mathematics and muscle, through labor and light, they created spaces that still leave us silent. When you stand today beneath the vaults of Chartres or Notre Dame, you are standing inside a thought, a dream made tangible. The wind that brushes your face through the clerestory windows is the same that touched the scaffolds 8 centuries ago. The stones still breathe. The geometry still prays. These cathedrals were not built to last forever. They were built to remind us that the act of reaching, of striving upward, is eternal. And so, when we gaze upon those spires, we are not just looking at buildings. We are looking at the purest expression of what it means to be human, to yearn for the heavens, and to build them, piece by piece, upon the earth. The cathedral as a cosmos. A bell tolls through the morning haze, its echo trembling against walls of glass and stone. The doors of the cathedral swing open, and for a moment, the outside world disappears. The cold wind softens into silence. Above, the air shifts alive with the slow shimmer of color and dust. You take a step forward, and just like that, you are no longer walking through a building, you are walking through a universe. To the medieval mind, the Gothic cathedral was not merely a house of worship. It was the world itself, ordered, illuminated, alive with meaning. Each stone, each angle, each beam of light belonged to a cosmic language written by God and translated by human hands. To enter its doors was to leave behind the narrowness of earthly life and step into the geometry of eternity. The nave stretched like time itself, from birth to death, from darkness to illumination. The choir was the voice of heaven, the altar the heart of creation. Every movement, from west to east, was a pilgrimage from the fallen world toward salvation. Every ray of light was a whisper of divine presence. And yet, the marvel lies in this. The builders did not merely decorate with symbols, they built them. They turned theology into architecture, scripture into stone. In their hands, geometry became gospel, and space itself became sacred. The Gothic cathedral is a miracle of mathematics, yes, but more profoundly, it is a map of metaphysics. Its proportions were not chosen for beauty alone, but for truth. To the masons of the 12th and 13th centuries, the laws of geometry mirrored the laws of God. The circle was infinite perfection without beginning or end. The square, the realm of man bounded, material, mortal. To bring the two together in the cathedral's ground plan, the square unfolding into the circle was to unite heaven and earth. The nave stretched on a perfect axis, aligned with the rising sun, for Christ was the light of the world. The transept crossed it like outstretched arms, the body of Christ upon the cross. The apse curved like a halo of dawn, where the first light touched the altar. Even the smallest details obeyed divine logic. Asterisk. The 12 columns around the choir echoed the 12 apostles. Asterisk. The 3 doorways of the western facade proclaimed the Trinity. Asterisk. 7 windows stood for the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Nothing was arbitrary. Every ratio was revelation. To stand within the cathedral was to stand inside a visible theology, a model of the cosmos as the Middle Ages understood it. Ordered, radiant, complete, The word nave comes from the Latin navis ship. To step into the nave was to board the vessel of faith, sailing through time toward eternity. But the nave was more than a ship. It was a body, the body of Christ, stretched from the entrance to the altar. The columns were ribs, the aisles were arms, the apse was the head crowned with light. Worshippers, gathered below, were the living cells of that body. In this vision, architecture was incarnation. The invisible became visible, the Word made flesh, the Spirit given form. And so, every Mass reenacted the creation of the world. Light entering darkness, order rising from chaos, the divine descending into matter. The Gothic cathedral was the stage where this cosmic drama unfolded again and again. From afar, the spires of the Gothic cathedral pierced the clouds like fingers of prayer. They were not mere ornaments, they were symbols of the soul's ascent. To the townspeople below, those towers were the axis mundi, the meeting point between heaven and earth. They anchored the city to the cosmos, just as Jacob's ladder once linked earth to heaven. Each level of the tower marked a stage of transcendence. The heavy base of human labor, the narrowing middle of aspiration, the delicate crown that vanished into sky. At the summit, bells rang not only to mark the hours, but to remind all who heard them that time itself belonged to eternity. Their echo drifted over fields, forests, and rivers, the sound of heaven calling across the world. A Gothic cathedral was also a calendar carved in stone. Its windows caught the sun at precise moments, solstice, equinox, feast days turning light into a liturgy of time. At Chartres, the sunbeam passes through a single pane of glass on the Feast of the Annunciation, striking a brass medallion on the floor. At that moment, heaven and earth align not by accident, but by design. The builders understood astronomy as part of theology. The same God who made the stars had arranged their patterns in harmony with the church. To them, to measure the heavens was not arrogance, it was reverence. Thus, the cathedral became a compass of both space and soul. Its eastward axis led the faithful toward the light of resurrection. Its rose windows traced the turning of the cosmos. Its bells kept rhythm with eternity. The entire structure was not only built for God, it was built within God's order. The medieval mind did not separate symbol from substance. A lion was not just an animal, it was the courage of Saint Mark. A lamb was not a metaphor, it was Christ in stone. A vine winding up a column spoke of the living church. A serpent underfoot, of sin subdued. Every carved leaf, every sculpted angel, every creature perched upon a capital participated in a grand allegory. To walk through the cathedral was to read a book written in light and shadow, in shape and sound. The illiterate could not read Latin scripture, but they could see it. They could see heaven and hell on the tympanum above the door. They could see the saints in stained glass, their robes blazing with the colors of salvation. They could trace the story of the world from Genesis to Judgment simply by walking down the nave. And through this visual gospel, they learned what every sermon tried to say, that all things from the humblest stone to the highest spire belong to one divine design. Light was the soul of the Gothic dream, but sound gave it breath. The cathedral was designed not only to be seen, but to be heard. The long echo of a choir's chant, the slow reverberation of organ pipes, these were not accidents of architecture. They were deliberate acts of resonance. The stone itself was tuned like an instrument. The vaults amplified the human voice into something celestial, a harmony that dissolved the boundary between body and spirit. To stand in the nave as a hymn rose toward the apse was to feel the music become light, the light become presence, and presence become peace. It was the medieval answer to a question we still ask: what does eternity sound like? Outside, the cathedral dominated the skyline. Inside, it contained the city itself. Within its walls were guild chapels, shrines, tombs, relics, and schools. Markets gathered in its shadow, coronations took place before its altar. It was not only a church, it was the heart of the community, the axis around which life revolved. In the medieval imagination, the cosmos itself was built on similar order. Heaven at the center, spheres turning around the divine light. And just as the cathedral gathered the life of a town, so God gathered the life of creation. The church was the universe made, local infinity brought home. When a pilgrim entered the portal, they crossed from the mortal to the eternal, from the city of man to the city of God. To walk through a Gothic cathedral was to make a pilgrimage through creation itself. You began in shadow beneath the western towers, where the great doors stood carved with scenes of the Last Judgment. The air was cold, thick with the scent of incense and candle wax. You looked up, and there above you heaven was already waiting. As you walked down the nave, the light changed. It moved from blue to gold, from sorrow to salvation. The stained glass guided your spirit as surely as the priest guided your prayer. At the crossing, where nave met transept, you stood at the center of all directions, the world's invisible heart. By the time you reached the altar, you had ascended not a staircase, but a vision. Your body remained on earth, but your mind stood among angels. In that moment, you understood what every stone had been trying to say. That faith was not something you carried into the cathedral, it was something the cathedral carried into you. Centuries later, when the Enlightenment would separate reason from faith, the Gothic cathedral remained as a silent argument against division. It stood as proof that knowledge and belief, science and spirit, could once dance together beneath the same vault. For the men and women who built these churches, there was no conflict between engineering and mysticism, between calculation and prayer. To measure the height of a spire was to measure the distance between earth and grace. And perhaps that is why, even now, when we step beneath those vaults, we still feel something ancient, stir a recognition that we are part of a vast, luminous pattern. That beauty is not decoration, but revelation. That in the meeting of stone and light, the universe remembers itself. As evening falls, the stained glass dims, and the cathedral returns to shadow. The last bell fades into silence, but the space remains alive, not with sound or light, but with the quiet pulse of eternity. The walls exhale the warmth of centuries. The floor remembers the footsteps of countless souls. And somewhere in the dark, a whisper seems to say, "You are standing inside the soul of the world." End of. For that is what the Gothic cathedral was, and is still, not merely architecture, but cosmos made visible. The dream of heaven carved in stone. The voices of the builders. The stones of a Gothic cathedral do not speak, yet they remember. They remember the hands that shaped them, the songs hummed on scaffolds, the prayers whispered before dawn. They remember the sweat, the dust, the faith, and the silence. If you listen closely, beneath the echo of the choir and the sigh of the wind through broken glass, you can still hear them, the voices of the builders. No royal chronicler recorded their names. No scribe wrote their stories in gilded margins. Yet without them, the dreams of abbots and kings would have remained drawings in dust. They were masons and carpenters, quarrymen and blacksmiths, glass blowers, sculptors, rope makers, and water carriers. They came from villages and distant lands, following the rumor of work or the call of faith. They slept in huts near the walls, their lives bound to the rhythm of hammers and bells. The cathedral rose one stone higher each day, and they grew old beneath its shadow. They were illiterate, most of them, but their labor became a language, a gospel carved in limestone. Their hands, rough and scarred, told stories their mouths could not. And when they died, their names vanished, but their fingerprints remained in the mortar. Every cathedral had its magister operatus, the master of the work. He was both engineer and philosopher, commanding not with words, but with lines drawn in dust and chalk. At dawn, he walked the site, studying the scaffolds, tracing cracks with calloused fingers, whispering to his apprentices about the balance of forces as if explaining a mystery of faith. He spoke in geometry, the sacred language of creation. He knew that one misplaced stone could ruin a decade's work, that a single error in proportion could silence the music of the vault. But more than knowledge, he needed patience for what he built he would never see finished. To be a master mason was to believe in the future as others believed in God. In the archives of Amiens and Chartres, we find fragments of their signatures, small sketches, initials scratched in hidden corners, a compass mark beneath the roof beams. Their faces are lost, but their minds endure in the symmetry of the stones. Among the laborers were boys who came with nothing but their hands. Apprentices, sons of peasants, orphans of war. They began by sweeping dust, fetching water, carrying tools. They learned by watching how to hold the chisel, how to feel the grain of the stone beneath their palm. The first time they struck a block, the master corrected them, not by words, but by gesture, a turn of the wrist, a nod of approval, a silence that meant again. For years, they shaped nameless fragments, a leaf here, a saint's foot there, until one day, the master let them carve an angel's face. And in that face, they poured every hope they had, their youth, their hunger, their fear of death. That angel still smiles down from the walls 800 years later. The cathedral, in its grandeur, was also a school. It taught not only theology, but craftsmanship, discipline, and devotion. The belief that beauty could redeem even the humblest life. In the scriptorium of the monastery, a monk bent over parchment, his fingers stained with ink. He was not a builder of stone, but of meaning. It was he who recorded the dream of Abbot Suger, who described Lux Nova, the new light that would flood Saint-Denis with divine brilliance. He wrote of the symbolism of columns and vaults, of light as the visible grace of God. He copied letters to distant abbeys, urging them to raise their own houses of glass and faith. But even he doubted. In his journal, he confessed, "Sometimes I fear that we build too high, that pride may climb with the spires." Yet he continued, because to him, doubt itself was wholly a shadow necessary to reveal the light. Outside the city walls, the pilgrim walked, his feet blistered, his cloak torn. He followed the spires that rose like promises above the fields. For him, the cathedral was not a monument, but a destination, the visible end of invisible longing. When he reached its gates, he knelt in the dust. Inside, the stained glass shone like a vision of paradise. He saw his life weary, small, filled with sin, reflected in the colors of saints and angels. He lit a candle, not knowing that the wax he offered would help light the work of the masons above. Faith was not separate from labor. It was its twin. The pilgrim's prayer and the builder's hammer beat to the same rhythm, the rhythm of redemption. In the quiet of the workshop, the sculptor leaned over his stone, his chisel whispering against the surface. He did not see himself as artist, but as servant. Each figure he carved was a sermon in silence, a sinner clutching mercy, a saint emerging from the roughness of the rock. Sometimes, he added small faces among the angels' faces of friends, or the woman he once loved. One carved imp at the base of a pillar wears the grin of a mischievous apprentice. One gargoyle bears the weary look of a mason who fell from the scaffolding and lived. The sculptor knew the church would never call his name, but he also knew this. When the sunlight touched his carving at dawn, it would speak for him. Art was confession. Stone was salvation. Far from the building site, in smoky workshops, the glassmakers performed their alchemy. They mixed ash and sand and metal into color cobalt for blue, copper for green, gold for red. They blew molten spheres that shimmered like captured sunsets, then sliced them into sheets, painting upon them stories of saints and sinners. They did not see their work installed. The glass would travel miles before finding its frame. But they believed that light itself was divine breath, and that to trap it in color was to hold a fragment of God. When the finished windows blazed in the cathedral, the people who made them were forgotten, but the colors kept their secret. Even now, when sunlight passes through, it carries their fingerprints and the memory of hands that once held fire. Each day on the site began with prayer. At sunrise, before the first hammer fell, the workers knelt together. They asked protection from the stones, forgiveness for their pride, strength for their limbs. Then came the noise, the endless symphony of creation. Iron on stone, rope creaking, shouts echoing up the nave. From a distance, it must have sounded like chaos, but up close, it was rhythm order disguised as struggle. When the bell rang at noon, they stopped, turned east, and sang a single psalm. Then they ate bread, onions, wine, and laughed, despite the danger, the exhaustion, the cold, for they knew that to build a cathedral was to live within a prayer. Each stone they lifted was a syllable in a sacred language. Each day's labor was one more verse in an unfinished hymn. They were not saints. They cursed when stones slipped. They argued, drank, and sometimes fled when wages failed. Some died in accidents, others of hunger or fever. The cathedrals rose over their graves. Yet their doubts and weariness were not enemies of faith. They were its proof. For belief, to them, was not a feeling. It was endurance. To keep building when your back ached, when your pay was late, when your child was sick, that was faith made flesh. In that sense, the cathedral was not built by faith alone, but through doubt. The masons did not always see God in their work, but they trusted that someday someone would. Centuries have passed. The builders' bones are dust. The names of kings and bishops fade from the chronicles, but the stones remain. And if you look closely, really closely, you can still find them. A mason's mark beneath a window ledge, a triangle, a spiral, a letter carved in secret, a handprint fossilized in plaster, a miscut arch repaired with care, invisible from the ground but left as testimony. Someone tried and tried again. These small gestures are the cathedral's true relics. They remind us that heaven was not built by angels, but by men and women who sweated, bled, and hoped. Every breath of wind that hums through the flying buttress is their afterlife. Every chime of the bell carries their story, their faith, their doubt, their exhaustion, all of it is still here, held within the breathing architecture of stone and light. When you walk today through the quiet nave of Chartres or Amiens, you are not alone. You are surrounded by ghosts, not of saints or kings, but of laborers. The walls are their diary, written without ink. The groove worn into the steps by centuries of feet, the uneven carvings hidden behind the altar, the scaffolding holes still visible high above the transept, these are their signatures, their afterword to history. The Gothic cathedral is their monument. It does not bear their faces, but it breathes their humanity. It preserves what words cannot, the sound of work, the weight of prayer, the silence between them. If the cathedral could speak, what would it say? Perhaps it would not speak at all. Perhaps it would simply breathe the same slow rhythm of stone and air that began 8 centuries ago. Perhaps that is its message, that faith is not noise, but endurance. That beauty is born not of perfection, but of persistence. And perhaps, in the hush after the choir has gone, you can still hear it, the faint murmur of chisels, the hum of a mason's song, the heartbeat of a dream too vast for one lifetime. Because in the end, the cathedral was never only about reaching heaven. It was about remembering that humanity, fragile, flawed, and finite, once dared to build something infinite. The power of height. At dawn, the spire pierces the mist. Its shadow stretches over the fields, over cottages and markets, over the slow river turning gold. From miles away, travelers lift their eyes, and there it is, the finger of God pointing toward the heavens. But beneath that sacred gesture lies something more human, more restless, a contest of pride, a hunger for glory, a war fought not with swords, but with stones. The 12th and 13th centuries were the age when faith learned to climb. Every city, every bishopric, every guild wanted a tower higher, a nave longer, a window brighter than the last. Canterbury against York, Chartres against Reims, Amiens against Beauvais, the very heavens watching as men measured piety in cubits and triumph in meters. In a Europe still scarred by famine and plague, height became hope. To build high was to say, we have survived, we are chosen, God dwells with us. The cathedral was both prayer and proclamation, a sermon made visible from miles away. And so, the Middle Ages looked upward, as if the earth were too small for its dreams. The church taught that heaven was above superiors, beyond the clouds, where the soul might one day rise. To lift stone upon stone, to pierce the sky, was not only an act of architecture, but of theology. Height itself was sanctified. Abbot Suger has spoken of anagogy, the upward movement of the soul toward the divine. If light could elevate the mind, then surely height could do the same for the spirit. The Gothic cathedral became a ladder of salvation, one rung at a time, from foundation to vault, from earth to paradise. But somewhere between heaven and earth, devotion blurred into ambition. The taller the spire, the nearer to God, or so it seemed, and thus piety grew competitive. For medieval towns, the cathedral was not just a church. It was their banner, their skyline, their identity. In an age before nations, cities were kingdoms unto themselves. Each sought to outshine its neighbor, not only in trade and textiles, but in sanctity. To possess the highest tower was to proclaim divine favor. Merchants funded chapels, bishops raised taxes, kings sent donations, and the people offered labor, all so that, one day, travelers would whisper, "Behold, there rises the greatest of all God's houses." The cathedral's height thus became a form of civic pride, a monument to both faith and fortune. And in the shadow of its walls, markets blossomed, universities grew, and power gathered. Make no mistake, the Gothic dream was never purely spiritual. It was also political. Every bishop who laid a cornerstone was also laying claim to authority. Every spire that pierced the sky proclaimed, the church rules not only the soul, but the horizon. When a new tower rose, it was both a house of God and a throne of influence. Its bells could call armies to crusade or announce the coronation of kings. Its shadow could bless or intimidate. Popes watched the rising spires with satisfaction. They were visible proofs of Catholic unity and might. But they also watched with concern, for each great cathedral made its bishop more powerful, its city more independent. Thus, the height of a cathedral was a paradox, an ascent to heaven that could also challenge Rome. Among all the cities that reached for heaven, none reached so high or fell so hard as Beauvais. In 1225, the Bishop of Beauvais looked at nearby Amiens and declared that his city would build higher, not by a few feet, but by many. The architects obeyed. They designed vaults so tall they seemed impossible, walls so thin they seemed miraculous. For a while, it worked. The choir of Beauvais rose like a vision, 48 meters of vertical ecstasy, light as lace, vast as the sky. But ambition has a weight of its own. On a cold morning in 1284, a section of the vault collapsed. Centuries of faith crumbled in seconds. No one died, but the dream broke. Still, Beauvais did not surrender. They rebuilt. They aimed higher still, adding a wooden spire that reached 153 meters, the tallest structure in Christendom. For a brief, shining moment, Beauvais had touched the clouds. Then, in 1573, lightning struck. The tower fell, shattering the choir roof, leaving only a wounded fragment of what once was. To this day, the cathedral stands incomplete, a monument to the audacity of faith and the frailty of pride. The people of Beauvais still call it La Cathédrale inachevée, the unfinished cathedral, but perhaps it was never meant to be finished. Perhaps it stands as a warning that not every ascent pleases heaven. To modern eyes, it seems strange that holy men would measure devotion with a ruler, but to the medieval mind, greatness was itself a kind of praise. To build higher was not vanity, it was courage. God, they believed, deserved nothing less than the impossible. If the Tower of Babel had been punished for hubris, then Gothic towers were its redemption, not reaching heaven against God, but toward him. And yet, pride seeped in, as it always does. Patrons wanted their names carved above the doors. Bishops wanted their tombs placed beneath the tallest vault. Sometimes faith and ego were indistinguishable, two faces of the same yearning. For height, like holiness, can intoxicate. It lifts, but it also blinds. It can bring one nearer to the divine or to the edge of disaster. To rise higher meant to risk more. Each meter upward multiplied the strain, the danger, the cost. Ropes snapped, scaffolds swayed, and the wind itself became an adversary. But the builders pressed on. They invented new tools, refined old techniques, and trusted mathematics like scripture. The higher the dream, the sharper the precision required to hold it. Some called it madness to gamble human lives on stone and symmetry. But for the medieval soul, faith was not safe. It was daring, perilous, magnificent. Every flying buttress was a confession of both weakness and genius, a concession to gravity that became poetry in motion. Even when they fell upward. The rivalry for height was not limited to churches. Kings, too, sought to raise their own monuments, castles, palaces, fortresses. But none could rival the cathedral, for its purpose was eternal. When the spires of Reims glittered in the sun, the King of France was crowned beneath them. When Notre Dame of Paris grew higher, it became not only a temple but a symbol of a city, of a nation, of a faith that ruled both crown and conscience. In this way, architecture became propaganda. The taller the spire, the greater the authority it implied. Every bell tower was a sermon in dominance, a message carved for the eyes of men and the gaze of God alike. Height was holiness. Height was hierarchy. Height was power made visible. But there was something deeper too, something that even politics could not contain. For when you stand beneath those towering vaults, you feel it. The pull of the vertical, the vertigo of the infinite. Height does not only dominate, it humbles. The same tower that asserts the church's power also reminds every soul of its smallness. You crane your neck, and suddenly, you understand the medieval mind, that longing to escape the weight of the world, to rise beyond hunger, beyond fear, beyond death. The tower is pride, yes, but it is also prayer. And between those two, the human heart has always hovered, suspended, trembling, reaching. In every age, the higher we build, the darker the shadow beneath. The cathedrals were miracles of faith and also monuments of inequality. While bishops commissioned spires, peasants starved in the fields. While gold leaf shimmered on altars, villages paid crushing taxes to fund their city's glory. And yet, the same peasants who carried the stones also believed in the dream. They did not see exploitation, they saw eternity. To them, every block lifted was a step toward heaven, not for themselves alone, but for all humanity. Perhaps that is why these cathedrals endure, because they were built not only by the proud, but also by the devout. Because even in the politics of height, there was a kind of grace. When the Renaissance arrived, men turned their gaze from heaven to earth. The Gothic dream waned. Its spires became relics of an age of faith. And yet, the desire to build upward never died. Every skyscraper, every tower of glass and steel, every monument that defies gravity, they are all descendants of those medieval spires. Modern ambition still carries the echo of the Gothic. We still build to be seen. We still reach for something beyond ourselves. The difference is only this. They built for God. We build for man. And perhaps that is why their towers still move us, because they remind us of a time when height was not only power but prayer. Climb the Tower of Chartres, and the wind becomes your only companion. The bells rest silent. The city below fades to murmurs. All that remains is air and stone and an overwhelming sense of purpose. From here, you see what the builders saw. The horizon without end, the clouds moving like living frescoes. You understand why they reached so high, not for glory, not even for heaven, but for transcendence itself. For in those rare moments above the world, one does not feel superior, but serene, not dominant, but devoted, as if for an instant, the human and the divine breathe the same air. And when you descend again past the bells, past the rafters, back into the dim nave where candles flicker, you carry that silence with you. The cathedral, it seems, is not only a place built to reach God, it is a place where humanity remembers that it can. Between light and darkness, at night, when the candles gutter and the last echoes fade from the choir, the cathedral sleeps. Its towers vanish into the mist, its glass turns black, its saints dissolve into shadow. Only then does one see it truly not as a triumph, but as a question. Because every dream that touches the sky must one day confront the weight of earth. The Gothic dream was no exception. It rose in light and ended in twilight, suspended forever between heaven and ruin. Even as the last stones were set, the cathedrals began to fracture. Some cracks were physical hairline, fissures creeping through pillars, vaults. Others were invisible doubts, heresies, and fears that gnawed at the heart of the age. In Beauvais in 1284, part of the choir fell. In Lincoln, in 1311, a spire snapped in the wind. In Siena, the grand cathedral extension was abandoned halfway up the walls. Across Europe, scaffolds stilled. The song of chisels fell silent. Each collapse was more than structural. It was spiritual. It whispered that even faith has limits that the heavens might not want to be reached. And yet, the people rebuilt. They patched, prayed, and persisted, as though defiance itself were holy. The cracks became part of the design scars of devotion carved into stone. Fire, the old adversary, came often and without mercy. Wooden roofs burned like offerings. Flames devoured beams, melted bells, and cracked the stained glass into molten rainbows. Chartres burned twice in 1020 and again in 1194. Reims caught fire in 1481. Notre Dame of Paris, struck by lightning, blazed in 1446 and centuries later, again in 2019. But every time, the people returned. They sifted through ashes, found fragments of relics, and built again. To them, fire was not the end, but the trial, a purification by which the sacred proved itself indestructible. In one chronicler's words, the flames took the wood but left the light. It is as if the cathedrals themselves were phoenixes, each time reborn, more luminous in ruin than in glory. Then came the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, death stalked Europe like a shadow with wings. In some towns, half the population perished. Bells tolled not for worship, but for the dead. The cathedrals became tombs, their vast spaces echoing with prayers that trembled more than they sang. The scaffolds rotted, the masons vanished, the glassmakers' furnaces went cold, and yet in the silence, faith changed. The cathedrals that had once shouted to heaven began to whisper. Their height, once a symbol of victory, became a reminder of humility. The people no longer asked how high they could build, but why. The plague had shown that no tower, no vault, no altar could protect the soul from the mystery of death. Still, the cathedrals endured dark, empty, and waiting. They became places not of pride, but of endurance. And when the survivors returned, they brought new prayers, not for conquest, but for mercy. By the 15th century, the Gothic style that once defined Europe began to age. New tastes emerged: the rounded harmony of the Renaissance, the rediscovery of ancient Rome. What had been divine now seemed excessive. The very height that once lifted the spirit was called grotesque, barbarous, medieval. Humanism replaced mysticism. The compass yielded to perspective. Stone angels gave way to marble philosophers. But the Gothic cathedrals did not vanish. They stood weathered, vast, and strangely alive, reminding men of an age when beauty had been measured not by reason, but by awe. In a world of order, they remained enigmas, dreams of the irrational divine. The Reformation brought a different kind of fire. No longer did flames consume the rafters. They consumed the meaning of the very stones. To Luther and his followers, the Gothic cathedrals symbolized the arrogance of the church, the wealth of bishops, the vanity of indulgences, the corruption that hid behind the veil of beauty. In 1524, mobs in Basel smashed stained glass, tore down statues, burned relics. In England, under Henry VIII, monasteries were dissolved, their cathedrals stripped of gold and song. Once again, the Gothic dream trembled, but it did not die. For even stripped of splendor, the architecture remained holy in form. A naked cathedral was still a prayer in stone. Its silence became its defense. Even the reformers, who despised its opulence, could not ignore its gravity. As John Calvin wrote reluctantly, almost reverently, there is terror in their emptiness, and that terror teaches humility. As centuries passed, many cathedrals fell into decay. Roofs collapsed. Ivy claimed the buttresses. Owls nested where choirs once sang. But ruin itself began to speak a different language, the poetry of time. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Romantic poets and painters rediscovered the Gothic as a mirror of the human soul, a beauty made profound by its wounds. Ruins became shrines of memory, places where history and eternity met in silence. Victor Hugo wrote Notre Dame de Paris not only to tell a story, but to save a cathedral. His words resurrected the Gothic not as theology, but as emotion. The church had built for heaven, the Romantics built for nostalgia, and so, even in ruin, the cathedrals breathed. They were no longer only houses of God, but temples of imagination, proof that the sacred could survive even its own destruction. But what truly was the lesson of their fragility? That faith, like stone, must bend or break. That beauty, no matter how holy, can become its own idol. The Gothic dream had always danced on that edge between ascent and arrogance, between prayer and pride. Its towers reached for heaven, but they also tempted the lightning. When Beauvais fell, it was not just an accident, it was a parable. The higher we build, the closer we come to the truth of our own limits. Perhaps that is why every Gothic cathedral feels slightly impossible. Because it is. Because it embodies both the miracle of faith and the inevitability of failure. Each spire that pierces the clouds also points downward toward the frailty of those who built it. Height and humility are inseparable. They are the two halves of belief. Yet, even in collapse, even in the black smoke of destruction, light endures. The stained glass may shatter, but the idea does not. For the Gothic was never only an architecture of stone, it was an architecture of yearning. When Chartres burned, the villagers wept. But when they rebuilt, they reused the broken glass, fitting shards into new designs. The light that once told one story now told another. And in that mosaic of imperfection, there was something purer, truer. It is said that after the fire of 1194, Chartres gained its most famous window, the Notre Dame de la Belle Verrière, the Blue Virgin, a fragment that survived the flames. Her face, serene and radiant, became a symbol of endurance. Around her, new panels were added, old light reborn in new form. That is the Gothic dream in its final truth. Not perfection, but persistence. In April 2019, Paris watched its heart burn again. Flames licked the spire of Notre Dame, and the world held its breath. It was as if 8 centuries collapsed into one night. People gathered on bridges and streets, singing hymns through tears. For a moment, it did not matter whether they were believers or not. What mattered was that something ancient, something that had survived kings, wars, and revolutions, was in peril. When the roof fell, a gasp rose from the crowd. But then, when the smoke cleared, they saw it. The cross on the altar, untouched, gleaming through the ash. And once again, as in the Middle Ages, fire became revelation. The Gothic dream had not ended. It had only reminded us that beauty must burn to be reborn. Every cathedral carries its own darkness, not just in its crypts and corners, but in its meaning. Because faith is not only light, it is also the courage to face the night. When one stands inside a Gothic nave, surrounded by color and silence, it is impossible not to feel both awe and sorrow. Awe for what humanity can create, sorrow for what it must lose to create it. The builders who lifted those stones are gone. The kings who funded them are dust. Even the faith that inspired them has changed. But the song remains the harmony between aspiration and ruin. That is the true Gothic paradox. It survives not despite its fragility, but through it. It teaches that beauty is never eternal, but always worth the attempt. To walk beneath those vaults today is to walk between two worlds, between what was dreamt and what endured. Light still falls through the windows, fractured by centuries of war, neglect, and repair. It no longer tells the same stories, but it tells something, that even when faith falters, the yearning for meaning does not. Each cathedral is a scar of hope. Each ruin is a prayer unfinished. Each beam of light that filters through broken glass whispers the same truth, that we are creatures of dust who will always reach upward. Between light and darkness, that is where the Gothic lives. The choir is gone, the candles are out, only the wind sings through the arches now. It carries a strange, solemn music, not of triumph, but of remembrance. For all its fractures, the Gothic cathedral still stands. It still commands the horizon. It still speaks, though its language has changed. Once it said, "God is here." Now it says, "We were here." And perhaps that is the most sacred message of all, that the same stones that reach for heaven also remember the hands that built them, and that between light and darkness, between faith and fire, humanity has always found its truest voice. The stone that still prays. Dawn again. 800 years have passed since the first stones were lifted toward the sky. The mist still clings to the fields of France, and bells still toll from distant towers. But the world around them has changed. Empires have risen and fallen, faith has fractured and reformed, and the hands that once carved angels now build cities of glass and steel. Yet through it all, the Gothic cathedrals remain, their silhouettes unwavering, their spires like fingers forever pointing heavenward. They no longer rule the skyline as they once did. Skyscrapers now compete for the clouds, satellites for the stars, and yet When one steps inside Chartres or Amiens, the air still changes, thickens, slows, deepens, as though time itself pauses to listen. What endures here is not just architecture. It is an emotion turned to matter, a human longing caught forever in stone. Walk through the nave at dawn. The first light slips through the stained glass, a trembling ribbon of color unfurling across the cold floor. Each beam carries the weight of centuries of eyes that once looked up in awe, of lips that whispered prayers now long forgotten. And still, the stone breathes. You can feel it, the quiet pulse of devotion trapped within its walls. These buildings were not made for comfort. They were made for transcendence. Every line, every curve, every carved face of a saint was a bridge between the finite and the infinite. When medieval masons worked, they knew they would never see the cathedral completed. They built for those yet unborn. They built for eternity. In that sense, each cathedral is both monument and miracle, a structure that holds not just weight, but time. You stand beneath vaults that were lifted by hands turned to dust centuries ago, and yet their labor still holds the sky aloft. It is as though the stones themselves remember every prayer spoken beneath them. When you listen closely inside a cathedral, the silence is never empty. It hums with invisible music, the echo of chants, the rhythm of hammer on chisel, the murmur of generations passing through its doors. No one voice remains, and yet all of them do. In their collective silence, they have become one vast, unending prayer. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of Gothic architecture, not just its beauty or its height, but its ability to listen. It receives humanity's longing and gives it form a vessel for every fear, every hope, every question that has no answer. The medieval builders may have spoken in Latin, but their true language was geometry, proportion, and light. And in that language, they asked a question that still trembles through every arch. Can stone believe? The answer, perhaps, lies not in the stone, but in us, in the way we still look up, centuries later, and feel something wordless awaken in our chest. That quickening of breath, that lift of spirit, that quiet reverence that is faith, reborn in the act of wonder. The light inside a Gothic cathedral is unlike any other. It is not merely illumination, it is transformation. As the sun passes across the sky, the windows change from sapphire to blood red, from emerald to gold. The saints and prophets shimmer into life and dissolve again into shadow. It is as if creation itself were breathing through color. Medieval theologians called it lux nova, new light, the divine radiance that makes the invisible visible. To them, light was not simply a physical phenomenon, it was the very presence of God. And in these cathedrals, they try to capture it to hold it, however briefly, in glass and lead. The result is something the centuries have not dimmed. Light as revelation, light as forgiveness, light as eternal memory. Even now, tourists who have long forgotten the language of prayer stop in their tracks when the morning sun strikes the rose window. They raise their phones, yes, but for one suspended heartbeat, they are pilgrims, not visitors. The same awe that filled a 12th century farmer or a 13th century monk still stirs within them. It is proof that wonder, like faith, never truly dies. It only waits for the right light. To say that cathedrals were born of faith is true, but incomplete. They were also born of fear, of pride, of ambition, of all that is most human. Cities competed to build higher towers, not only to honor God, but to outshine their neighbors. Kings and bishops sought immortality in stone, and yet even those vanities became sanctified, transmuted by the sheer act of creation. Because in the end, to build something that endures, something that reaches upward, is itself a form of prayer. It is humanity's rebellion against decay, against death, against oblivion. Every vault and buttress is a refusal to accept the limits of flesh. In striving toward heaven, the builders discovered something divine within themselves. the power to imagine eternity. And that perhaps is what the Gothic dream truly was, not a dream of God alone, but of humanity. A dream that we could mirror heaven, not by escaping the earth, but by transforming it. Today, the pilgrims come not on foot, but by train, by car, by camera lens. They arrive from Tokyo, Buenos Aires, Nairobi, New York. They wander through the same doors that peasants once entered barefoot. They no longer pray for salvation. They pray for silence, for meaning, for a moment of stillness in a restless world. Some light a candle. Some whisper a name. Some simply stand there, letting the colors fall across their faces. In that moment, they are joined with every soul that ever stood in that same light. The centuries fold together. Time becomes translucent. In the old dream, the dream of reaching for heaven breathes again. Look once more, from the base of a cathedral up to its spire. It is not a straight ascent, but a trembling one, a conversation between weight and grace, effort and surrender. The stones strain against gravity, yet they hold. It is the same struggle we live every day. The desire to rise, the inevitability of fall, the miracle of still standing. When you touch the cold wall of an old cathedral, you touch more than stone. You touch 1,000 hands, 1,000 dreams, 1,000 acts of faith layered one upon another. And in that contact, something passes between you and them, the unspoken promise that even when belief fades, the longing for the divine endures. For what is a cathedral if not a shape given to yearning? What is a spire if not a human hand forever reaching upward? The stones may crack, the glass may fade, but the gesture remains unchanged, unbroken, eternal. Outside, morning comes again. The bells ring, their echoes mingling with the sound of traffic, the voices of a modern city. And yet, within the ancient walls, the light continues its slow, sacred procession, painting saints and sinners alike with the same golden mercy. A young child looks up at the ceiling and whispers, "It's so high." Her mother smiles. So did the masons once. So did the monks. For that simple awe, that childlike wonder, is where every cathedral truly begins. And perhaps that is where it will always begin. For as long as there is light, as long as there are eyes to see it, the stones will keep praying not to any one God, but to the endless human dream of touching heaven. So when you next pass by a cathedral, pause, look up. The light that falls through its glass is the same that once guided the hands of the builders, the same that fell upon their faces as they prayed for strength, the same that shone on the first dawn of the Gothic dream. It is the light that never truly left us, the light that still calls us to rise. And so, our journey ends where it began, beneath the shadow of stone and within the reach of light. For centuries, these cathedrals have stood as both question and answer, proof that faith once had the strength to lift mountains, and that beauty, even in ruin, still points toward heaven. The hands that built them are long gone. The voices that once filled their choirs are dust. Yet somehow, the song continues. It hums in the mortar, it breathes through the glass, it lingers in the silence between each toll of the bell. Perhaps that is what the Gothic dream truly gave us. Not perfection, but persistence. The promise that even when our age forgets how to pray, the stones will remember for us. When you next walk through a city street, look at the towers of steel and glass rising above you. They too are children of that same dream. The dream of building higher, of reaching for something beyond the limits of our own making. And if you ever find yourself inside a cathedral, pause, listen. The air still holds the breath of the builders. The light still carries their faith. You do not need to believe to feel it. You only need to look up, because to look up is to remember. To remember that once Humanity's greatest hope was not to conquer the heavens, but simply to touch them. This was the Gothic dream: why medieval cathedrals reached for heaven. If you've enjoyed this journey through faith, art, and stone, I invite you to stay for more stories from the past that still breathe within our world today. Until next time, keep your light burning and your eyes lifted toward the sky.